The evening was born and light. Not the soft glow of a street lamp or the flicker of a candle, but the fierce diamond-bright gleam that only Hollywood could summon, hundreds of bulbs igniting at once, bouncing off gowns stitched in silver thread, tuxedos cut so sharp they looked as though they could slice the air. The boulevard leading to the Grand Theater was a river of movement, limousines sliding to a halt, photographers calling names with voices sharp as camera shutters, reporters, in glittering dresses balancing microphones in one hand and cue cards in the other. And into this fevered world stepped Will Smith, a man whose face had been part of cinema's tapestry for more than 3 decades. He carried himself with a kind of presence that couldn't be rehearsed. It was the weight of years spent under the heat of lights, the gravity of roles that had moved audiences from laughter to tears. That night, his tuxedo was as perfectly tailored as a soldier's uniform before inspection. The black silk gleaming against the crisp white shirt, the bow tie resting at his collar like a final precise stroke of a painter's brush. Cameras fed his image to millions of screens before he had even reached the entrance. Yet there was something beneath the polished surface, a subtle heaviness in his eyes. The quiet way his hands flexed at his sides as if gathering patience. The theater inside was a cathedral to spectacle, velvet seats, polished floors, golden arches glimmering in the stage lights, everything designed to remind you that you were in the presence of an event history would remember. Will took his place among the constellation of stars, every face around him a household name, every smile perfected for the moment the lens found them. Yet, in that sea of carefully maintained composure, Will's thoughts were somewhere else. He felt the weight of the evening pressing in from all sides, not just the anticipation of whether his name would be called for the golden statue, but the unshakable reality that every breath he took, every movement he made, could be magnified into something it was never meant to be. The ceremony began, a seamless parade of laughter, applause, and choreographed glamour. A host cracked jokes with precision timing, nominees smiled graciously, winners delivered speeches polished to perfection. To the millions watching it was flawless, but in Will's chest there was a low, quiet drumbeat, the pulse of a man navigating the razor-thin edge, between the persona the world adored and the human being beneath it. He thought of the decades, behind him the early days, when he had fought to be taken seriously, the roles that had stretched him until he no longer recognized the man on screen, the moments when the price of fame had been exacted not in money but in pieces of his privacy, his peace, his very self. The stage that glittered before him was both a dream realized and a cage gilded too brightly to escape. He smiled when the camera found him, but behind that smile lived memories of nights when the applause had faded and the silence had been deafening. Fame, he had learned, was not a crown but a weight, and some nights it pressed so heavily it became hard to breathe. Yet he had never been one to break in public. His discipline was a fortress, but even the strongest walls could crack when the right pressure was applied. The host's voice rang out again, sharp, playful, carrying another joke across the room, harmless to most ears, but to Will, it landed differently. His body stilled. It wasn't the joke alone, but the years of little cuts that it echoed, the private battles that strangers had turned into public amusement, the moments when the people he loved had been turned into punchlines without consequence. The room laughed, the way rooms do when the person on stage controls the rhythm of the evening. But Will's eyes didn't. The sound became distant, like hearing a conversation underwater. His thoughts narrowed, his breathing slowed. He could feel the eyes of the cameras, could hear the invisible hum of millions watching in real time. Every second stretched until it felt like its own lifetime. It is in such moments that choice takes shape, not the neat, measured choice of a calm afternoon, but the instinctive, unguarded decision born from the deepest part of oneself. He sat in the glare of the lights, feeling the collision of two truths, the need to uphold the image the world expected, and the equally fierce need to draw a line, here and now. That said enough. He could almost hear the ticking of the unseen clock, the silent countdown to the decision that would tip the night from scripted perfection into something raw, unscripted, and unforgettable. His fingers curled slowly against his knees. He felt the stillness before movement, the inhale before the plunge. All around him, the ceremony rolled on as though nothing in the world had shifted. Yet within him, the course of the night had already begun to bend. The world was seconds away from watching a moment that would fracture neatly into before and after. The host's voice lingered in the air, its playful tone fading under the weight of silence that Will felt in his bones. Around him, people laughed uneasy, reflexive laugh meant to keep the night light, but Will's ears didn't hear it the way they did. Every syllable of the joke replayed in his mind, not as sound but as an echo of every past moment when dignity had been chipped away under the warm glare of public amusement. In the front rows, the expressions were carefully composed, some mouths curved into small, nervous smiles. Others flickered with the faintest trace of discomfort, but no one moved. The stage lights poured over everything in gold, but to Will, they felt like a harsh interrogation lamp, demanding a response. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips, the tight coil in his chest winding tighter with each breath. The truth was, Will had always been a man of control. In his world, image was currency, and self-discipline was survival. He had endured headlines that distorted his truth, interviews that twisted his words, and whispers that grew into storms without warning. But this moment was different, not because it was more public, but because it reached into the most sacred part of him, the people he loved. It's one thing to carry the weight of being misunderstood yourself. It's another to watch the ones you hold closest become collateral damage in the theater of public entertainment. And now, with millions of eyes watching, the laughter pressed against him like a rising tide, he could have stayed seated. He could have worn the same practiced smile, clapped politely, and swallowed the sting until it dissolved into the night. But somewhere between his chest and his mind, a decision took root, wordless, instinctive, inevitable. His body began to move before the thought was fully formed. He rose from his seat, each step measured but deliberate, the sound of his polished shoes against the floor cutting cleanly through the laughter. In that instant the air shifted. The host's grin faltered slightly, unsure whether this was part of some elaborate bit or something else entirely. The audience, caught between amusement and confusion, began to lean forward in their seats. Sensing a break in the perfect script of the evening, Will's walk to the stage was not rushed, but it carried a momentum that no one could interrupt. The lights followed him, casting his shadow long and sharp across the stage floor. For those in the back rows, it must have felt like watching a slow-motion scene from a film, every detail amplified, every step carrying the weight of an unspoken history. The host straightened, microphone in hand, half-smile frozen in place, as if waiting for the punchline that never came. And then, with the precision of a moment that would live in memory far longer than the night's winners, it happened. The sound of it, quick, sharp, undeniable, cut through the theater. It wasn't the loudest sound in the room, but it was the one that would be replayed, slowed down, analyzed from every possible angle in the days to come. For a split second, the world seemed to stop. The host's face froze in an expression caught between shock and disbelief, while the audience sat in stunned stillness, unsure if they had just witnessed a scripted twist or something real enough to alter the very tone of the evening. Will stood there, his chest rising and falling, eyes locked not on the audience, not on the cameras, but on the man before him. It was not anger in his gaze, it was something deeper, heavier, a silent statement drawn from years of patience, finally reaching its breaking point. Without a word, he turned and walked back toward his seat. The room remained frozen, a fragile silence hanging over the golden grandeur. Even the applause, when it came, was hesitant, a ripple rather than a wave, as though no one was certain whether to follow the script or acknowledge that the script had been torn. Will sat down, his breathing steady but his heart still pounding in his ears. He knew without question that the moment had already left his control. Out there, beyond the theater walls, millions of conversations had already begun. Social media lit up like a city at night. Within minutes the clip was everywhere, looped endlessly, dissected, slowed frame by frame. Headlines were already forming, some praising him for standing his ground, others condemning the public display. Commentators, influencers, strangers across continents all found themselves speaking his name, attaching their own narratives to the seconds they had witnessed. And yet in that seat, in the quiet between the host's shaken recovery and the next award announcement, Will felt a strange clarity. The world would talk, they always did. But for the first time in a long time, his actions had been entirely his own, unfiltered by publicists or expectations. As the ceremony pressed on, trying to regain its rhythm, Will sat still, aware of the eyes that flicked toward him in curiosity, judgment, admiration, or disbelief. He was no longer just a nominee, no longer simply a guest at the celebration. He was the center of its gravity now, whether he wanted it or not. The gold statue, the speeches, the carefully crafted moments, all of them would fade under a shadow of what had just occurred. And though the night would end, and the theater would empty, and the red carpet would roll back into its storage crates, the echo of this moment would not be contained by walls or time. It would follow him into the morning headlines, into the late-night talk shows, into the endless churn of public opinion. But for now, in that suspended space before the world outside could reach him, Will allowed himself to simply breathe. The lights burned overhead, the show continued, and the night, as it always did, marched forward. But somewhere deep inside, he knew nothing about this night would be forgotten. The morning after was not gentle. It rarely is when the world has turned its full attention toward you. The sun rose as it always did, casting gold over the city's glass towers. But for Will Smith, the light felt different, sharper, almost intrusive, as if it carried with it the weight of millions of eyes peering into his life. The night's events had already taken on a life of their own, spilling across every platform, whispered in coffee shops, debated in offices, dissected in newsrooms. Headlines bloomed like wildfire. Will Smith's unforgettable moment, shock. At the ceremony, lines crossed on Hollywood's biggest night. Each outlet told the story in its own tone, twisting and stretching the details to fit whatever narrative they needed. To some, he was a man who had stood in defense of respect. To others, he was a cautionary tale of pride, overwhelming composure. Will sat in his kitchen, coffee untouched, phone face down. The device had been buzzing since dawn. Calls from friends, texts from family, emails from his team, interview requests from journalists around the globe. He wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. He wanted the noise to settle, but he knew enough about the world to understand that it wouldn't, not for a long time. The image of him walking to that stage was already burned into public memory. People had slowed the footage, frozen his expression, debated his intentions as if they had lived inside his thoughts. And what struck him most was that none of them were truly wrong, yet none of them were entirely right. The truth was more complicated than the quick headlines allowed by midday. The calls from his publicists became insistent. "We need a statement," they said. "Something that will calm this down before it spirals." He thought about what calming it down would mean, whether it meant softening his truth to fit the comfort of others or standing by his actions and bracing for the storm that would follow. Silence could be dangerous, but words could be worse, if they weren't the right ones. He replayed the moment in his mind, not with regret exactly, but with a heavy awareness of its cost. The theater, the lights, the ripple of shock in the crowd, all of it was clear, as if it had happened just seconds ago. By evening, the backlash and praise had reached a fever pitch. Hashtags carried his name across borders. His face appeared on screens in countries he had never visited, and strangers spoke with conviction about what kind of man he was. The thing about fame, Will knew, was that people believed their perception was the truth, and once the perception hardened, the truth often didn't matter. Some saw bravery, others saw weakness, but few saw the full human complexity behind the act. That night, away from the glare of the public, Will found himself sitting in his backyard under a sky dusted with stars. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet that made the noise of the world feel distant, almost unreal. He thought about the man he had been before fame, the boy from Philadelphia with big dreams, the artist who had worked tirelessly to be seen, the actor who had poured himself into every role. Somewhere along the way, the line between the public, the figure, and the private man had blurred until they were almost the same. And maybe that was the heart of it. That moment on stage wasn't the actor. It wasn't the brand. It wasn't the calculated star. It was the man. The one who had lived through victories and losses, love and heartbreak, triumph and humiliation. The one who, for just a few seconds, had acted without filtering himself through the lens of what the world might think. In the weeks that followed, invitations for interviews continued, documentaries were pitched, and offers came in for exclusive tell-alls. He declined them all. This wasn't a story he was ready to sell. It was still his, even if the world had tried to claim it. And slowly, he began to rebuild his days, not around repairing an image, but around living with the knowledge that sometimes, the moments that define us are the ones we least expect. The glare of the headlines would fade eventually, they always did, but the personal truth of that night would remain with him. Months later, he stood backstage at another event, this one far less glamorous but far more meaningful. It was a community fundraiser in his hometown, a room filled not with Hollywood royalty, but with neighbors, teachers, and young artists who reminded him of himself years ago. No cameras swarmed him here. The applause was warm, not deafening. He felt at peace in a way he hadn't in a long time. When he stepped up to the microphone, he didn't speak about the incident directly. Instead, he spoke about resilience, about standing in moments when you're misunderstood, about owning your actions even when they come with consequences, and about finding your way forward no matter how heavy the spotlight. The audience didn't see the man from the headlines. They saw Will, not the brand, not the scandal, but the person. And for him, that was enough.